I want to tell you something that the Conclave doesn't want you to know. Not because it's classified, not because it breaks any treaty. They don't want you to know it because knowing it changes the way you look at everything. Every star, every ship, every species in this galaxy that has spent the last 400 years pretending they have humanity figured out. They don't. They never did. And on the 14th day of the Velthari Summit, they finally learned what that actually meant. My name is Corporal Yusuf Ademi Crane, and I was there. I was standing 12 feet from the delegate podium when Ambassador Sulveth of the Thari Dominion looked out at a room full of the galaxy's most powerful beings and said something that the official record describes as a diplomatic advisory. That's not what it was. It was a warning. And I remember thinking, watching the room, watching the faces of every alien dignitary, every conclave official, every Thari officer in their glass and light armor, that none of them understood what they were being warned about. They thought they did. That was the problem. They had spent so long studying us, cataloging us, theorizing about us, that they believed the data was the thing. They believed that if you had enough information about a species, you had that species. You don't. You especially don't have humanity. Let me back up. Let me tell you how we got here, because this story doesn't start at the summit. It starts 3 years earlier, on a transport shuttle from Earth Station Aurelius to the Deeprim station called Threshold Point, and it starts with a conversation I overheard between 2 Velthari diplomatic aides. I wasn't supposed to be there. I mean, I was supposed to be there. I was assigned security detail for the human delegation, but I wasn't supposed to be in that corridor. I'd taken a wrong turn looking for the commissary, which, in my defense, was labeled in 6 different alien scripts, and exactly none of them were standard. So I'm standing in this corridor, half-lit, smelling like recycled air, and something that I later learned was Thari ceremonial incense, and I hear 2 of the aides talking. I didn't understand their language, not then. I've since had it translated. One of them said, "The humans are bringing armed escorts again. They always do." And the other one said, "They're afraid." And the first one said, "Of course they are. They're always afraid. That's their baseline state." And then the second one laughed. It wasn't cruel exactly. It was just dismissive. The way you'd talk about a pet that had learned a new trick but still didn't quite understand the world. I stood there in that corridor for a long moment. I thought about my grandmother, who grew up in Lagos during the first contact period, who watched the Thari survey ships come down and told her children, told my mother, that the only way to survive what was coming was to understand it before it understood you. I thought about my grandfather on my father's side, who had been part of the 3rd wave of human volunteers for the Joint Defense Initiative, who came back from the Rim Wars with a prosthetic left hand and the quietest eyes I had ever seen on a living person. I thought about all of that. And then I found the commissary, got myself a coffee substitute that tasted like someone had described coffee to a machine that had never tasted it, and I went back to my post. But I remembered what they said. They're afraid. That's their baseline state. Here's the thing about being afraid. Humans are afraid a lot. We're afraid of the dark, we're afraid of dying, we're afraid of being forgotten, we're afraid of failing the people who depend on us. We're afraid of heights and confined spaces and the deep ocean and the void between stars. We are genuinely one of the most fear-capable species in the known galaxy. But here's what every species that has ever made the mistake of studying humanity's fear response, without studying what happens after it has missed. We don't stop. That's the thing, that's the actual thing. Fear doesn't stop us. Pain doesn't stop us. Exhaustion doesn't stop us. You can take away our weapons, our technology, our supply lines, our reinforcements, and we will pick up rocks. You can take away the rocks and we will use our hands. You can break our hands and we will use our teeth. And the whole time, some part of us is thinking, how do I get out of this? How do I protect the person next to me? How do I make sure this doesn't happen again? We don't stop. The Thari Dominion spent 30 years studying human military history and came away with the conclusion that we were a violent but primitive species whose aggression could be managed through careful diplomatic pressure and superior technology. They were looking at the wrong variable. They were measuring the violence. They should have been measuring the persistence. Ambassador Sulveth arrived at Threshold Point on the 15th of March, 2338 CE, aboard the Dominion flagship Resplendent Accord, which was, I will say this because it's true, genuinely one of the most beautiful ships I have ever seen. It was like someone had built a cathedral out of living crystal and taught it to fly. The way it caught the light from the nearby star, it looked like a sunrise that had been preserved in glass. The human delegation shuttle, by contrast, was a battered Meridian-class transport called the Patricia Ann that had survived 2 wars, 1 catastrophic engine failure, and what our pilot, Sergeant Vera Kowalczyk, called, "That time we definitely didn't crash land on Hellion 7, and I will go to my grave saying so." We pulled up alongside the Resplendent Accord, and the size difference was, we looked like a barnacle on the hull of a whale. I watched Kowalczyk look at the Thari flagship through the forward view screen with this particular expression she had, like she was doing math in her head. "Nice ship," she said. "Yeah," I said. "Bet it burns well," she said. I didn't say anything, but I made a note. That was the human delegation's chief pilot, our first official moment of proximity to the most powerful diplomatic vessel in the Thari Dominion, and what she saw was structural vulnerabilities. Not because she was planning anything, not because she was aggressive or dangerous or baseline afraid. Because she was a veteran, and veterans look at things and see how they end. It's not a choice. It's just how the lens is ground after enough years. The summit itself was held aboard Threshold Point Station, which is, one of the engineering achievements of the post-contact era. It's a joint construction project, half human design and half conclave standard, which means it looks like someone welded 2 completely different architectural philosophies together at the midpoint, and then told both teams to stop arguing. The human design sections have lower ceilings, better lighting, more emergency exits than are strictly necessary by galactic code, and every corridor is wide enough to run down. Every corridor. I didn't design it, but I understood the instinct. The conclave design sections are all soaring open spaces and ambient light and surfaces that shift and breathe. Beautiful, impractical in an emergency, like everything designed by beings who have never really had to run. The summit chamber was in the conclave section, naturally. I spent the first 3 days of pre-summit proceedings doing what security personnel do, which is stand in specific places and watch specific arcs of sight lines and try to look simultaneously alert and non-threatening. It is genuinely one of the hardest performance challenges in professional life. The alien security forces had their own deployments. Thari in their light armor, the crystalline stuff that shifted color with their mood. It's a biological thing, the color shift, not intentional, which made reading them easier than they realized. A Thari whose armor had gone faintly amber was nervous. Deep violet was calm. The ones who went red at the edges weren't angry exactly, more like hyper-focused. Most of the Thari guards stayed deep violet throughout the pre-summit proceedings. I made note of that too. The human delegation was small by conclave standards. Ambassador Dr. Riane Oska Champong, 50s, former neurosurgeon, had spent 8 years on the frontier medical stations before transitioning to diplomacy, which she said was basically the same job but with fewer scalpels, plus her aide. A young man named Callum Bridger, who I suspected had never left Earth before this assignment, and was handling it by writing extremely thorough notes about everything. plus me and 3 other security personnel, Sergeant Kowalczyk, Corporal Danny Reyes, and a quiet giant called Private First Class Tomás Vega, who had the unsettling habit of reading poetry in his bunk. 6 humans total. The Thari delegation was 47. The Velthari Observer Corps alone was 32, plus their military attaches, plus their own security contingent. There were representatives from 11 other species attending as observers, support staff, and what the conclave called diplomatic facilitators, which as far as I could tell meant beings who were paid to stand between other beings when they started disagreeing. 400 and something entities, total, in and around the summit chamber. 6 of us were human. Callum Bridger came to find me on the second day. He was doing that thing nervous people do where they walk quickly, but try not to look like they're walking quickly, which just makes them look like they're trying not to run away from something. "Corporal," he said, "I need to show you something." He had a datpad. He turned it so I could see. It was a translation of part of a Thari position paper, officially part of the pre-summit background documentation, the kind of thing that gets exchanged weeks in advance so everyone can prepare. "Read the 3rd subsection," he said. I read it. Then I read it again. Then I said, "When did this come in?" "It was in the original packet," he said, "but I don't think Ambassador Oscar Champong's team flagged it. The translation software rendered it as a standard territorial assessment." "That's not a territorial assessment," I said. "No," said Callum Bridger, who was 23 years old and had never left Earth before this and was managing to keep his voice very steady. "It's not. What it was a detailed analysis of human military response protocols, with particular attention to what the document called the suppression threshold. It was clinical and thorough, and it had the feeling of something written by someone who had done a lot of research and had come away from that research with a conclusion they felt very comfortable with. The conclusion was, essentially, humans will not escalate beyond a certain point if their primary leadership structure remains intact. Remove the leadership, and the collective loses coherence. This is their fundamental vulnerability. I stood there reading it, and I thought about my grandfather's quiet eyes. I thought about every veteran I had ever known, and the specific quality of stillness they had, and how that stillness had never been the absence of something. It was the presence of something, held very carefully. I thought about what would happen if someone, in a room full of the galaxy's most powerful entities, made the kind of move that document was theorizing about. "I'm going to need you to take this to the ambassador," I said, "right now, and then I'm going to need you to not mention it to anyone else." "Why not anyone else?" he asked. I looked at him. He understood, I think. He nodded and walked away quickly again. Ambassador Oscar Champong read it in her quarters that evening. I was there. She read it once, put the datpad down, and was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "They think we're a hive with a queen." "Yes," I said. She picked the datpad up again. "Do we know if this is Sulveth's position specifically, or Dominion-wide doctrine?" "We don't," I said. She set it down again. "Yusuf." "Ambassador, I need you to understand something. This summit is important. Not just politically important, genuinely important. There are 6 inhabited systems in this sector whose resource rights are being negotiated here, and if those negotiations fail, 2 of those systems are looking at conflict within a decade. Real conflict. Thousands of lives." "I understand," I said. "So I need your read on this. Is this a threat, or is it a posture?" I thought about it. Not for long, because honestly I'd been thinking about it since Callum Bridger put that datpad in my hands, but I took a moment to make sure I was being precise. "It's doctrine," I said. "I don't think Sulveth put it in the pre-summit packet as a threat. I think it's there because it's what they believe. They've done their analysis, and this is what they concluded about us, and they filed it the way you file any other background assessment. Meaning they're not planning something. Meaning they believe they won't need to plan something, because they believe they understand us well enough that nothing will escalate beyond their management capacity. She was quiet again. That's somehow more concerning, she said. Yes, I said, it is. Part 2, the room where it happened. I want to describe the summit chamber for you, because the space matters. It was a room designed to make everyone in it feel small. Not in a hostile way. I don't think the conclave architects intended it that way, but in the way that certain sacred spaces make you feel small, the way cathedrals do, or the really old ones anyway, the ones built before architecture decided that God should feel approachable. This was the other kind, the kind that makes you think about how large everything else is. The ceiling was maybe 40 meters up, open lattice construction that showed the stars beyond the station's hull through a layer of transparent alloy. The lighting was ambient, sourceless, the kind of soft blue-white that exists nowhere in nature, but reads as neutral to approximately 11 out of 14 known species with visual perception. The floor was dark and polished and reflected everything. The delegation tables were arranged in a semicircle, and I want to note for the record that the human table was exactly the same size as every other delegation table, which I know because I measured it. This was either a deliberate statement of equality or just standard conclave logistics, and I was told by 3 different people that it was absolutely the latter and I should stop reading into it. I measured it anyway. Our chairs were the same too. Actually, our chairs were slightly more comfortable than the standard conclave issue, which I later learned was because when the station was constructed, the human design team had quietly swapped out the seating for our section of the common areas, and no one had noticed until the Thari interior specialists did a walkthrough and pointed it out, at which point the station director, a calm, ancient Velthari named Curator Eshatham, had said that the chairs were fine and to leave them. I liked Curator Eshatham. The summit opened with the formal ritual that every conclave meeting opened with, which involved symbolic acknowledgement of each delegation's home star, a light display showing the mapped extent of known space, and then 3 minutes of silence that different species apparently used for different things: meditation, prayer, threat assessment. I genuinely wasn't sure. I used it to go through sight lines again. The Thari security contingent were positioned at the 3 main entry points and the raised observation gallery at the room's curved back. Their officer in charge was a Thari called Velketh, who I had been watching since we arrived. Velketh was older than the others, amber-tinted more often than violet, and had the particular quality of someone who was very, very good at their job and was currently in a room that they had assessed and found manageable. Our 4 humans were stationed by conclave protocol outside the main chamber in the anteroom. This was standard. Security personnel from individual delegations didn't operate inside the chamber itself unless there was a declared threat situation. The conclave's own security, supplemented by Thari contingent, handled the interior. This was a fact that I had registered, filed, and been quietly unhappy about since the moment I read the security arrangement brief. I said nothing about it officially, because the arrangement was not mine to change. But I talked to Rias and Vega and Kowalczyk the night before the summit opened, and I told them, know the routes. Know every route from that anteroom into that chamber. Know them in the dark, know them if you can't see, know them if everything is loud and you can't think straight. They didn't ask why. They just learned the routes. The first 2 days of the summit were what diplomacy usually is: careful, slow, full of language that meant one thing written down and something else said aloud. Ambassador Osea Champong was extraordinary at this. I watched her work and understood, in a way I hadn't before, how surgery and diplomacy are actually the same discipline. The same precise intervention in a system that is trying to go wrong. The same requirement to stay calm while your hands are inside something that could kill someone if you slip. Sulveth was impressive too in his way. The Thari had a physical quality to their communication. They were tall, maybe 2.5 meters on average, with those color-shifting exoskeletal plates that functioned as a kind of involuntary emotional display, and they used the height and the color deliberately in formal settings, modulating it the way a human speaker modulates tone. Sulveth was very good at it. He could hold Violet for hours. I watched Sulveth watch Osea Champong on the first day. There was something in the quality of his attention, not disrespect exactly, more like fascination, clinical, the way you'd watch something you had studied extensively and were now seeing in person for the first time, the way you'd watch a specimen. I didn't like it, but I kept that to myself because what I liked wasn't the point. It was on the evening of the third day that Callum Bridger found me again. He looked worse than the first time. He had that particular pallor of someone who hasn't been sleeping, and his notes, he was always carrying the datpad, always taking notes, were more frantic than they'd been before. "They're asking about our command structure," he said. "Who is?" "The Thari attaches, socially." At the evening reception, he showed me the datpad. He'd been transcribing conversations. This one here, they asked Director M. Wangapatel from the logistics team who she reported to, and this one, they asked one of the conclave stewards which of our delegation had decision authority. They're building a map. I read through his notes. He was right. The questions were subtle, the kind of thing you could dismiss individually as small talk, curiosity, social navigation. But put them together and they were constructing a picture. Who gave orders? Who had authority? What the chain looked like. Remove the leadership, and the collective loses coherence. "Callum," I said, "I need you to listen to me carefully." "Okay," he said. "What you're doing, the notes, the translations, this is genuinely good work. This matters, okay?" "Okay," he said again, quieter. "And I need you to keep doing it. But I need you to also understand something about humans, and I need you to really hear it, because I think it's going to matter in the next few days." He waited. "We don't have a single point of failure," I said. "That's not how we're built. They think we do because they're looking at our formal structures, the ambassador, the chain of command, the official authority ladder. And that's real, those structures exist. But they're not the thing, you understand. They're the map, not the territory." "What's the territory?" he asked. I thought about how to say it. "Every human in this station," I said, "has been trained on some level for exactly the scenario they think breaks us. We train for decapitation. We train for loss of leadership, loss of communication, loss of everything except the person next to you and the thing you're trying to protect. We have been doing that for 10,000 years of recorded history and 100,000 before that." He was quiet. "They've studied our wars," I said. "They cataloged the battles. They measured the casualties. What they didn't ask is why every army that has ever tried to defeat humanity by targeting our leadership has eventually run into the same problem." "What problem?" he asked. "We just keep making new ones," I said. Part 3. What SOLVTH said. On the 8th day of the summit, Ambassador Sulveth of the Thari Dominion made what the official record calls his primary address on the matter of resource sovereignty and joint development protocols. I was in the anteroom. I was watching through the glass panel on the anteroom door, standard practice. You keep eyes on the room even when you're not in it. That's just how it works. What I can tell you is that the room changed while he was speaking. I didn't have the translation feed in my earpiece at that point. Our comms had been having interference issues with the Thari signal array since day one, a thing that our technical specialist had flagged, and the Thari technical team had been extremely helpful and cooperative about addressing in ways that had not actually fixed the problem. so I was watching without audio. But I could read the room. I could read it in the way Ambassador Osaka Champong's posture shifted. That particular shift where a person who is trained to hold themselves still holds themselves very, very still, and you understand that the stillness is the thing. I could read it in the way Callum Bridger's pen stopped moving. I could read it in the way the Thari guards in the gallery went from deep violet to a color I hadn't seen before, something between red and a color I don't have a name for, something that sat at the edge of my visual range. I pressed my earpiece. The feed crackled. I caught fragments. Human capacity for organized resistance has been significantly reassessed. Static. The Dominion's position on the security framework would be static. In the event of human noncompliance with the proposed terms, the Dominion is prepared to. And then the feed cleared, just for a moment, just long enough. Just long enough for me to hear Sulveth say, in perfectly translated standard, in a voice that carried the calm of someone who genuinely believed what they were saying. Which is why the Dominion wishes to advise the assembled conclave that humanity, while capable of considerable instinctive aggression, lacks the structural cohesion necessary for sustained conflict at a galactic scale. Their military capacity should therefore not be weighted as a meaningful variable in the framework negotiations. They are, in our assessment, manageable. I stood there. Danny Rios was next to me. She had her own earpiece. She'd caught it too. I could tell because she had gone very, very quiet in a way that she didn't usually go quiet. "Corporal," she said. "I know," I said. "They just told the whole conclave we're not a threat." "I know." "In front of us." "I know." We stood there for a moment. "Are we going to do something about this?" she asked. "The ambassador is going to do something about this," I said. "That's her job. Our job is to make sure she's safe while she does it." Rios looked through the glass panel. "She looks calm," she said. "Yes," I said, "she does." Here's what I didn't know at the time, and only learned later from Callum Bridger's extremely comprehensive notes. What Sulveth said in that room was not, technically, the most inflammatory thing he said that day. The most inflammatory thing was what he said 20 minutes later, in a closed session with just the senior delegates and the conclave officials, with no security personnel present and no official translation record. He said, and I am working here from Bridger's notes, which he compiled from 3 separate sources, 2 of them alien, which is a level of thoroughness that I genuinely respect. He said that the Thari Dominion was prepared to guarantee stability in the contested sectors under a new joint sovereignty framework, and that this framework would include provisions for managing the human factor. Someone asked him what he meant by that. He said, "There are intervention protocols. They are humane. They are calibrated to produce cooperation without significant harm. We have modeled this extensively." Someone else asked, "The humans will agree to this framework?" And Sulveth said, and Bridger's source says he said this with great confidence, with the unshakable confidence of someone who has done the math and trusts the math. They will, once the parameters of the alternative are made clear. Ambassador Osaka Champong came out of the chamber at the end of the morning session. She looked calm. I said she looked calm, and I want to be precise about what I mean. She didn't look fine. She didn't look like someone who was okay with what had just happened. She looked calm the way a deep ocean is calm on a still day. All of the force is just below the surface, organized, moving in a specific direction, very, very sure of where it's going. She said, "Yusuf, Ambassador, we need to talk." We went to one of the small conference rooms off the main corridor. Her, me, Kowalczyk, Rios, Vega, and Bridger, who had been waiting outside the chamber door and looked like he had been waiting with every cell in his body. She sat down. She said, The Thari Dominion has just proposed a framework that would effectively subordinate human resource rights in 6 systems to Thari administrative oversight, and justified this by publicly characterizing humanity as strategically negligible. Silence. The conclave did not object, she said. For the record, I want that noted. Bridger noted it. The conclave's position, she continued, appears to be that if the Thari want to frame it this way, and if humans don't demonstrate sufficient objection, the framework stands. Kawoksik said, what does sufficient objection look like? In diplomatic terms, Osea Champong looked at her. It requires a formal counterproposal, backed by demonstrated capacity to either contest the framework militarily or withdraw cooperation in ways that damage Thari interests. And in plain terms, Kawoksik asked. The ambassador was quiet for a moment. We need to remind them, she said, of what they've apparently forgotten. Vega looked up from his corner. He was the quiet one, Vega, but when he spoke it was always worth listening. He said, with respect, Ambassador, I don't think they forgot. I think they never knew. She looked at him. They studied the wrong thing, he said. They measured what we did. They never measured what we are. Part 4, the 14th day. I need you to understand the sequence of events very carefully, because the way it's been reported in official conclave archives has some significant gaps. Here is what happened. On the 14th day of the summit, Sulveth was scheduled to present the formal version of the sovereignty framework for conclave ratification. If it passed, and it was expected to pass, the Thari had done the political groundwork. It would be binding within 90 days. What that meant in practical terms was that human settlements in the Herath-Roman 4 cluster, the Voss Belt, and 4 other systems would be under joint administration that, on paper, was balanced, but in practice gave the Thari veto authority over resource extraction, defense agreements. And this is the part that mattered, the right to station Thari enforcement vessels in human-administered space for stability maintenance. They called it a partnership framework. Osea Champong called it a cage in private to me, on the night of the 13th day, when she was sitting in the conference room with cold coffee and a datpad full of legal text, and the particular expression of someone who is very tired and very clear-eyed and very, very done. They built it carefully, she said. That's the thing. They built it so that every individual provision sounds reasonable. Individual provision by individual provision, you could defend each one. It's only when you see the whole shape of it that you understand what it actually is. What are we going to do? I asked. She looked at me. I'm going to walk into that chamber tomorrow, she said, and I'm going to do my job. The morning of the 14th day. I was in the anteroom at 600, 2 hours before the session was scheduled to begin. Rias was with me. We weren't supposed to be there that early, but we were there anyway, and the conclave's own security, a pair of tall, gray-plated beings called Vether-Ren, that I had developed a respectful nod-based relationship with over the previous 2 weeks, didn't say anything about it. At 7:30, something happened that was not scheduled. A Thari military vessel, not a diplomatic ship, a military vessel, a Dominion cruiser class called Dominant Will, which I had been informed about because I look up every unfamiliar ship I hear mentioned docked at Threshold Point. This was not announced. This was not in the schedule. I got the alert on my secondary device, the one that ran on a separate frequency from the main comms system, the one that picked up the station's traffic control chatter. I'd set it to flag anything unexpected. I flagged it to Osea Champong. She was already dressed, already prepared for the morning session, sitting at the small desk in her quarters with a cup of actual coffee, real coffee. She'd brought a supply from Earth, and she read my message and set the cup down very deliberately. She sent back, "Let them know we know." I spent a moment with that. Then I went to find Velketh. Velketh was in the corridor outside the Thari delegation's quarters, amber-tinted, which told me he was not having a calm morning. I walked up to him. He looked at me with those compound Thari eyes, the ones that pick up more of the light spectrum than human eyes do, and I looked back at him, and we had a moment. "Corporal Ademi Crane," he said. His standard was good, better than most of the other Thari. "Commander Velketh," I said. "You are outside your scheduled position," he said. "So are you," I said. He was in the corridor outside the delegation quarters rather than the security station. We both knew it. A long pause. "The dominant will," I said. "When was it added to the station's docking schedule?" Something moved in his face. Not much. Thari faces don't move the way human faces move, but something was there. "I'm not aware of," he began. "Commander," I said, "not aggressive, not threatening, just level. The way my grandfather used to be level, that specific quality of a person who is not trying to intimidate you but is not going to pretend they don't see what they see. We know it's there. We know when it arrived. I'm asking you directly because I believe you are a professional, and because I believe you would prefer a direct conversation to an indirect one." He looked at me for a long time. His armor went from amber towards something I hadn't seen before. Not red, not violet, somewhere in between. "It is a precautionary measure," he said, "per standard protocol for high-stakes negotiations." "Whose protocol?" I asked. "Silence." "Commander," I said, "Ambassador Osya Champong is about to walk into that chamber. She is going to do her job. I am asking you directly as one security professional to another, are we safe in there?" He was quiet for a long time. And then he said, quietly, and I think this cost him something. I think this was not what he had been told to say if anyone asked, "Corporal, I would advise your ambassador to choose her words today with great precision." I nodded. "Thank you," I said. I walked away. I told Osya Champong what he'd said, word for word. She was quiet for exactly 2 seconds. Then she said, "Good, thank you, Yusuf," and she picked up her coffee and finished it. I want to tell you what it was like in that anteroom as the session began. It was the 4 of us, me, Rias, Vega, Kowalczyk. The Conclave security team were at their posts. The Thari security were at their posts. Through the glass panel, I could see the chamber filling. I could see Sulveth at the Thari table. He was deep violet, completely composed, the portrait of a diplomat who is about to do a thing he has prepared carefully for and has no doubt will go as planned. I could see Osya Champong at the human table, small desk, small chair, 1 datpad and a glass of water. Callum Bridger 2 seats to her left, pen ready. I could see the conclave officials at the central dais, Curator Eshatham among them, those ancient patient eyes that had seen centuries of this. The session opened. What happened in the first 40 minutes was diplomacy. The formal kind, the careful kind, Sulveth presenting the framework's provisions one by one in the measured cadence of something that had been rehearsed until it was smooth. The conclave received it. Several observer delegations nodded or made their equivalents of nodding. And then the presiding official said, "The floor is open for response from the human delegation." And Ambassador Dr. Rene Osya Champong stood up. I watched through the glass. I couldn't hear it clearly, the comms were still intermittent, but I could see it. I could see her stand, and I could see the room's attention shift to her, and I could see the quality of that attention, which was, I want to be honest, somewhat patronizing. The polite attention you give to someone whose response you expect to be manageable. She started speaking, and I watched the room change. Not dramatically, not all at once, but I was watching carefully. I was watching the specific body language of every entity in that room, and I could see it happening piece by piece. I could see the moment Sulveth's armor went amber. I could see the moment the conclave officials began to lean forward. I could see the moment the observer delegation stopped doing the equivalent of politely waiting and started actually listening. My comms cleared partially, in fragments, and I caught pieces of what she was saying. The historical record is available to every member of this body. Static. And what that record demonstrates, if you look at it without the filter of what you expect to see, is not a species that can be managed. Static. We have been beaten repeatedly by entities with superior technology, superior numbers, superior resources. Every time, and every time. Static. We got back up. I pieced it together later from Bridger's notes, from the official transcript, from the fragments I caught. Here is what she said, as close as I can reconstruct it. She said that she appreciated the Thari Dominion's thorough analysis of human military history and capability. She said she had read the assessment documents with great interest. She said that she understood why, looking at the data, the Dominion had reached the conclusions it had. She said, "But I want to point something out. Your analysis is very thorough on the question of what humans have done in conflicts. It catalogs our victories, our defeats, our technologies, our tactics. It is genuinely impressive work." She paused. "What it doesn't address," she said, "is why." Another pause. Why do we keep going? Why, when we've lost the battle, when we've lost the commander, when we've lost the supply lines, when by every rational assessment the conflict should be over, why do we not stop? She looked at Sulveth directly. "Because you don't have an answer to that question in your framework," she said. "And that is the only question that matters." Sulveth responded, "I caught some of it." He said, and he was still violet, still composed, and I'll give him this. He was composed. He said that the Dominion's assessment was based on comprehensive data, that the historical record spoke for itself, that human resilience was a factor that had been weighted appropriately. Oskia Champong said, "May I share something with this body?" She didn't wait for formal permission. She just opened her datpad and turned it so the room's display system could pick up the projection. What appeared on the chamber's main display was a list. It was a long list. The list was every instance in recorded human history, from the pre-contact era through to the present, where a superior force had attempted to defeat humanity through the targeting of leadership or the destruction of organizational infrastructure. It was annotated. The annotations noted, for each instance, what the superior force had expected to happen after the leadership was removed. And then, beneath that, what had actually happened. "I want to draw your attention," Oskia Champong said, "to the right-hand column." The right-hand column was what had actually happened. In every case, without exception, in every single case on that list, some of which spanned decades, some of which involved the near-complete destruction of every formal military and governmental structure humanity had, the right-hand column said some version of the same thing. Resistance continued. New leadership emerged. Conflict escalated. Outcome: name of superior force, eventually ceased operations, withdrew, or was defeated. The room was quiet. I was watching through the glass and I could see it, the quality of silence that descends on a room when something lands. Not the polite silence of people waiting for their turn to speak. The real silence. The silence of people who are realizing they may have made an error in their calculations. Sulveth spoke again. I missed most of it, but I caught the tone. He was still calm. He was explaining something, clarifying. And then, this is the part the conclave archives don't include, because by this point the official recording system had developed an inexplicable technical fault, and I am recording what I saw through that glass panel as a first-hand account. Then something changed in the room. One of the Thari attaches entered from a side door. He went to Sulveth and spoke to him quietly. Sulveth's armor shifted. Not amber, not the red edge of hyperfocus. Something I had never seen on a Thari, a pale, washed-out color that had no name in my frame of reference, like the color you'd get if you drained violet of everything warm. He stood up. He said something. Bridger's notes tell me what it was. I'm going to tell you exactly what it was because it matters. He said, the dominant will reports that its communication systems are experiencing interference. It is unable to reach Dominion Command. Pause. Additionally, he said, 3 conclave monitoring stations in the outer sectors are reporting anomalous energy signatures in regions adjacent to human-controlled space. Another pause. We are, the Dominion is. We are seeking clarification on the source of these signatures. Here is what I know about the anomalous energy signatures. I know what they were because I found out later, and I'm going to tell you, because this is the part that makes everything that came after make sense. They were human vessels. Not military vessels, not officially. They were a combination of Earth Defense Fleet ships operating under what the EDF calls a precautionary proximity deployment, which is the category that gets used when someone thinks there might be a problem developing near a human diplomatic mission and wants to be close enough to respond without being close enough to be accused of posturing. There were 31 of them. They had been there, holding position just outside formal monitoring range, for 6 days. They hadn't announced themselves. They hadn't transmitted. They were just there. And the dominant will, which was a Thari military cruiser and a genuinely formidable piece of engineering, had suddenly become aware that it was sharing the neighborhood with 31 human vessels that had arrived quietly and had been sitting quietly and were very clearly not going anywhere. I want to be honest with you about something. I don't know if those ships were sent as a deliberate counter to the dominant will. I don't know if someone in EDF command had the same information I had, if they'd read the same assessment document, if they'd tracked the dominant will's docking and responded. It's possible that the proximity deployment had been scheduled before any of this, that it was routine, that it had nothing to do with the summit. It doesn't matter. What matters is that 31 human vessels, which had not fired a shot, had not broadcast a single transmission, had not made any aggressive move whatsoever, had simply existed in the vicinity, had turned a Thari cruiser that was docked at a station that contained a human diplomatic mission into an extremely nervous Thari cruiser. The Thari had come here believing we were manageable. They had brought the dominant will as what Velketh called a precautionary measure. And we had 31 ships just sitting there in the dark, not saying anything. They're afraid, that's their baseline state. Part 5, the moment that changed everything. The chamber broke for recess. 15 minutes, official. I moved. I went to Velketh, who was no longer in the corridor outside the delegation quarters but was now at the main security station, talking to 3 of his officers in rapid Thari. His armor was that washed-out pale color. His officers were amber-edged. "Commander," I said. He looked at me. "Are we going to have a problem?" I asked. Velketh looked at his officers, then back at me. He said, "Corporal, what are those ships doing?" "Sitting," I said. "Sitting?" "Yes." "For what purpose?" I looked at him for a moment. "Because they were asked to be there," I said. "Because when one of our diplomatic missions is operating in a location that has a Thari military cruiser added to its docking schedule on short notice without announcement, someone thought it might be a good idea to have some friends nearby." Pause. "Just in case," I said. Velketh was very still. "Commander," I said, "I want to be clear with you because I think clarity is what this moment needs. Those ships are not going to do anything, not unless they're given a reason to. Nobody in that chamber is planning to give them a reason." Ambassador Osia Champong is going to go back in there and finish her presentation, and we're going to work toward a framework that actually works, or we're going to work toward an agreement to continue discussions, and then everyone is going to go home. Pause. But I need you to understand, I said, and I need you to understand it clearly, and I need you to make sure your delegation understands it. Those ships are going to be there whether or not anyone wants them to be. And if something goes wrong in that chamber, if this stops being a diplomatic disagreement and becomes something else, those ships are going to know about it within 30 seconds. Velketh's armor did something complicated. Several colors moved through it in quick succession. How, he said. Your communications have been experiencing interference. Our primary comms have, I said. Yes. Another long moment. He understood. He understood that there was more than one communication system. He understood that the interference had been on the frequencies his people were monitoring. I watched him understand it. I watched his armor settle slowly back toward Violet, not all the way, but moving. The ambassador, he said, intends to complete her presentation. Yes. And the Dominion's framework will either be revised, I said, or it won't. That's for the diplomats. My job is to make sure the ambassador gets home safe. Her job is to make sure the framework that comes out of this room is one that actually serves all the parties involved. Including humans, he said. Especially humans, I said. Yeah. He looked at me for a long time. You are, he said slowly, not what our briefing suggested. I thought about my grandmother in Lagos, my grandfather's quiet eyes, 2 kids in a corridor on a transport shuttle, laughing about how afraid we were. No, I said, we're really not. The recess ended. Everyone went back into the chamber. I went back to the anteroom. I'm going to tell you what happened in the second half of that session, and I'm going to tell it straight. Ambassador Osia Champong went back to the floor. She said, I'd like to propose a modification to the framework. Not a rejection, a modification. She proposed that the resource administration provisions remain joint, as the Thari had drafted, but that the enforcement provisions, the part that allowed Thari vessels in human space for stability maintenance, be replaced with a joint oversight mechanism, rotational, with representatives from both the Thari Dominion and the human system's own governing bodies, answerable to the conclave. She proposed that this mechanism have no unilateral enforcement capacity, only referral authority to the full conclave body. She proposed that the existing human defense arrangements in the contested sectors remain unchanged. She presented this calmly, methodically, with citations to conclave legal precedent, and she presented it in a way that was, and this is the part I keep coming back to, the part that I think was the real demonstration of everything she'd said, that was completely reasonable. Not aggressive, not threatening, not angry. Just clear. Here is what is acceptable. Here is what is not. Here is the legal and practical basis for that distinction. Here is what happens next. Sulveth requested a recess. The Thari delegation spent 45 minutes in private conference. When they came back, Sulveth said that the Dominion was prepared to consider a modified framework along the lines of the ambassador's proposal, subject to certain definitional clarifications. That's how it was recorded. Prepared to consider. What that meant, and Bridger and I talked about this for a long time afterward, cross-referencing the Thari diplomatic language conventions, what it meant was, yes. It was yes. The session continued for 3 more days. The framework that eventually came out of it was not the Thari proposal. It was not entirely the modified counter-proposal either. It was something that had been worked on line by line, provision by provision, with conclave facilitators in the room and both delegations at the table and Callum Bridger's notes getting increasingly extensive. The final document was 47 pages. In it, there is no provision for unilateral Thari enforcement capacity in human-administered space. In it, the joint oversight mechanism is exactly as Osya Champong proposed. In it, there is a clause. I know this because I was in the room when she drafted it, sitting at the small table in the conference room at midnight, 3 days before the summit ended. A clause that states, in formal conclave legal language, that no framework agreement shall be construed to limit any signatory species' right to maintain its own defense capacity within its own administered space. It's Clause 7, Paragraph 3. She called it the "we can still say no" clause. Part 6, what has OLVETH actually said? This is the part that gives this account its name. On the last day of the summit, after the framework was signed, after the formal closing ceremonies, after the conclave had made its statements and the various delegations had made their statements, there was a reception. I was there, security, as usual. Sulveth approached Ambassador Osya Champong. I was close enough to hear. Bridger was there too, and he wrote it down. Sulveth said, "Ambassador, may I speak with you candidly?" She said, "Please." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The Dominion came to this summit with a thorough understanding of human capability. We had analyzed your military history, your political structures, your economic systems. We had modeled numerous scenarios for how these negotiations might proceed, and we had prepared responses for each of them." She waited. "We did not model this," he said. She said, "What didn't you model?" He was quiet for another moment. "We did not model," he said, "the fact that you would come into this room and simply refuse, without escalation, without aggression, without anything that our models would have coded as threat behavior." A pause. "You simply told us no and explained why and waited for us to understand it." She said, "That's diplomacy." "For you," he said. "For us, based on our models, that was, we did not have a response protocol for that." Another pause. "Our models," he said slowly, "were based on the assumption that your species' threshold for organized persistence was manageable, that there was a point at which you would weigh costs and benefits and choose a less costly path." She said, "There is a point like that." "Yes," he said, "but we placed it in the wrong location. We thought it would occur before the point of actual conflict, that the threat of consequences would be sufficient." She said, "The threat of consequences is sufficient for some things." He said, "And for other things?" She looked at him for a moment. "For other things," she said, "there isn't a consequence you can threaten that changes what we're going to do, because some things aren't cost-benefit calculations for us. Some things just aren't." He processed that. He said quietly, in a way that Bridger's notes describe as unlike anything he had said in the chamber, without the diplomatic frame, just the question itself. "What things?" She said, "The things worth protecting." That's the conversation. That's the one that Bridger wrote down, and that I have been carrying in some form since that room, since that reception with its ambient alien lighting and its smell of Thari incense, and the sound of 31 human ships in the dark outside, just sitting there. The things worth protecting. Later that night, after the reception, after the delegations had started dispersing, and the station had gone to its quiet cycle, I was in the corridor doing a last sweep. Velketh fell into step beside me. We walked for a while without talking. Then he said, "Corporal." "Commander." "I have been in Thari security service for 30 years, he said. "I have attended 14 major diplomatic events. I have worked with 31 different species." I waited. "I have never," he said, "attended an event where I was more concerned about what would happen if something went wrong." I said, "Did something go wrong?" He said, "No, it did not." "Then why were you concerned?" He was quiet for a moment. "Because," he said, I realized very quickly that my models for what would happen if something went wrong were incorrect, and I did not have time to build better ones. I nodded. What would have happened, he asked, if something had gone wrong in that room? I thought about it. Those 31 ships, I said, would have become a very different conversation. And the dominant will, he asked, would have been in a very difficult position, I said. He walked in silence for a moment. Our cruiser, he said, is among the most capable vessels in Dominion service. I know, I said. It carries a crew of 1,200. I know that too, I said. We walked some more. Corporal, he said, I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer honestly. I'll do my best, I said. If the dominant will had, if something had gone wrong in that room and the dominant will had taken action, he paused. Those 31 ships, would they have engaged, knowing the disparity? Knowing what the dominant will is capable of? I thought about my grandfather's hands, the prosthetic left one, the real right one, the quiet eyes. I said yes. He absorbed that. And if they had lost, he asked. I said, then they would have sent more. Long silence. How many more? He asked. I looked at him. Commander, I said, that's the question the Dominion should have asked before they wrote that assessment document. This account was recorded by Corporal Yusuf Ademi Crane 3 months after the conclusion of the Velthari summit. It has been cross-referenced against Callum Bridger's contemporaneous notes, the partial official transcript, and separate testimonies provided by 3 non-human observers who agreed to speak on condition of anonymity. Ambassador Dr. Riane Osha Champong subsequently served 2 more terms as humanity's senior diplomatic representative to the Galactic Conclave. She is credited with negotiating 7 additional framework agreements during that period. She declined to be interviewed for this archive, but authorized its publication. Commander Velketh retired from Thari Dominion Security Service the following year. He now serves as a diplomatic liaison between the Dominion and the Conclave's Cross-Species Security Bureau. He and Corporal Ademi Crane have exchanged correspondence twice since the summit, which both parties agreed to keep private. The Thari Dominion's internal assessment documents, the ones that characterized humanity as manageable, were revised and reclassified after the summit. The Dominion has not made the revised documents available for external review. However, a Thari political scientist who examined the original documents published a paper the following year in which she wrote that the fundamental error was not in the data collection but in the interpretive framework. She wrote that the Dominion had made the mistake of studying human behavior as a closed system, measuring inputs and outputs, modeling responses to stimuli, without adequately accounting for what she called the irreducible variable. She defined the irreducible variable as the human capacity to decide that a thing matters enough to do it regardless of personal cost, and to maintain that decision under conditions that would cause the decision to collapse in any other species. She noted that this variable appeared in the historical record with remarkable consistency across time periods, technological eras, and geopolitical configurations. She noted that no external factor appeared to reliably suppress it. She ended her paper with a line that has been quoted extensively in subsequent political science literature across at least 9 species. When you try to calculate what humans will do if pushed past a certain point, you must accept that there is no such point. There is only the thing they are protecting and the fact that they will not stop. The 31 EDF vessels that held position during the summit were never publicly acknowledged by the Earth Defense Fleet Command. They were listed in internal logistics records as a routine rotation exercise in the outer rim. They had been there for 6 days before the dominant will arrived. They had been tracking the dominant will since its departure from Thari Dominion space. They had said nothing. They had done nothing. They were just there. The Velthari Summit framework has been in operation for 3 years at the time of this publication. The resource rights of the 6 systems it covers have remained intact. There have been no enforcement actions. There have been 2 minor disputes referred to the Joint Oversight Mechanism, both resolved through arbitration. The human settlements in the Herathroman 4 cluster are, by all available measures, doing fine. The Dominant will completed its docking at Threshold Point, departed peacefully at the conclusion of the summit, and has not returned to that region of space. Last thing. I want to tell you the last thing, the thing I keep coming back to when I think about those 2 weeks, that room, those 31 ships in the dark. A few weeks after we got back to Earth Station Aurelius, I got a message from Callum Bridger. He'd been reassigned to the Conclave Translation Bureau, which made sense. His language skills were extraordinary and the diplomacy had given him a taste for it. He was good. He was going to be very good. He sent me a short message. He said, "I've been thinking about what you told me in the corridor, about humans not having a single point of failure. I've been thinking about it a lot. I don't know if I understood it then, but I think I understand it now. I wanted you to know." I wrote back. I said it takes time. The Thari had 30 years and they still didn't get it. You figured it out in 3 weeks. You're ahead of the curve. He sent back a single line. "Because I grew up human," he said. "We learn it young. We just don't always know that we know it." That's it. That's the whole thing. A room full of the most powerful entities in the known galaxy. And the only thing that changed the outcome was 6 humans who knew exactly what they were willing to do if they had to, and the clear-eyed decision to walk into that room and say so. Quietly, without anger, without a single weapon drawn. Just, this is what we are. This is what we protect. This is what we will not do, and this is what we will do instead. Figure out what that means to you. They figured it out. They always do, eventually. Every species that has ever looked at humanity really looked, past the data, past the models, past the careful cataloging of victories and defeats. Every species that has done that has arrived at the same moment. The moment they understood that the variable they forgot to calculate wasn't capability or technology or numbers or political will. It was the simple, unreasonable, absolute refusal to stop. We are, on balance, a reasonable species. We prefer peace. We prefer negotiation. We prefer sitting across a table from each other and working things out like adults. But beneath that preference, underneath all of it, at the bedrock level where things are decided and not just discussed, we are the species that came down from the trees onto a savanna full of things that wanted to eat us, and we looked at all of it, and we picked up rocks. And here we are. 31 ships in the dark. Not threatening anyone. Just here. Just waiting. Just making sure. That's us. That's always been us.